Is a big wide receiver move incoming for the Pittsburgh Steelers? We talk about that and so much more coming up next on this episode of Locked On NFL.
You are Locked On NFL, your daily NFL podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On NFL podcast, your daily NFL podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher. I'm the host of Locked On Ravens and one of the many NFL experts here on our network, the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here today, making Locked On NFL your first listen each and every single day. We're free and available on all podcasting platforms. That includes in video form on YouTube, where you can like the video, subscribe to the channel. Also in audio form, you can turn notifications on and follow along with us there and subscribe anywhere you get your favorite podcast. We're here for you 5 days a week, bringing you the biggest stories across the NFL. Today's episode of Locked On NFL is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more right now. New customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. We're a couple weeks removed from the 2024 NFL draft, but storylines still plenty throughout the NFL, and we're going to be getting into the biggest ones over the course of the last week. First, talking about is a big wide receiver move incoming for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Chris Carter of Locked On Steelers will join us to talk about that and Pittsburgh's other moves at the position. Then in the second part of the show, Tyler Rowland of Locked On Titans will join us to talk about them adding more firepower with Tyler Boyd. And then we'll be joined by your boy Q of Locked On Raiders. The Raiders signed a couple of veteran wide receivers in a revamp of their offense. So without any further ado, let's first get into our conversation with Chris Carter of Locked On Steelers. The Pittsburgh Steelers have made a lot of moves over the last couple of weeks, and here to talk about that with me is Chris Carter, the host over at Locked On Steelers. Chris, we know that receiver has been a topic of conversation for Pittsburgh pretty much all offseason. They have George Pickens, and that's their guy, but they move on from Deontay Johnson, trading him to Carolina, and it seems like Pittsburgh is just making all these little moves here and there to try to round out the receiver room a little bit, the most recent one being Scotty Miller. So it seems like Pittsburgh has a plan in mind, but I want to ask you what exactly that plan is, because it seems like with new offensive coordinator Arthur Smith, a lot of these receivers are related to him in some way.
Yeah, I think that their plan right now at Steelers wide receiver is to see what they have. And I think look, if none of these guys look like they can be a solid number two to George Pickens by the start of the season, I think you will see the Steelers make a move. But I think that they're in a position to like, hey, you know what? We got what we wanted in the offensive line. We got what we wanted, on defense. The Steelers right now are in a position where they'll figure wide receiver out if it doesn't work. But you look at the offseason free agents that they've added at this position: Van Jefferson, Quez Watkins, Marquez Callaway, Scott Miller, and then there's other smaller guys they kept on the team like Denzel Mims and Des Fitzpatrick, who were higher picks for other teams in the past, who are now just sitting there trying to make the team. And they still have Calvin Austin, who they drafted 2 years ago in the fourth round. Then, of course, Roman Wilson from Michigan, who they drafted in the third round this year. I think part of this is if Roman Wilson turns out to look like a number two wide receiver in training camp, not just in rookie camp, which we just saw, or OTAs or mini camp, but if they get to training camp and that guy is looking really good, that might put them in the position where they feel like they don't need to go and get one. Or if, say, one of this plethora of wide receivers, this ensemble of just guys that they brought in, turn into if Roman Wilson can be a decent 2 and then one of them could be a solid 3, they might feel comfortable. You know what? No need to make a big move to go get a big name wide receiver. But I also think from what we've understood and what we've heard, the Steelers have inquired around the league about what would it take for certain teams to move off on guys. They also know that certain teams want to move off on guys once training camp gets there, because they'll say you know what, we have a young receiver that we want, we don't need to pay this guy any more than we are. And that's where Courtland Sutton comes into play as far as a guy with the Broncos. Now, as it stands right now, it seems like Courtland Sutton and the Broncos are pretty happy with each other, but everyone's looking at it as a possibility for something to happen down the line if certain things work out. For example, the Steelers right now, they've drafted Troy Fautanu and Broderick Jones the last 2 years. That means they have a starting tackle in Dan Moore Jr., who's probably going to be on the bench this year, who's been a starter for 3 years in the NFL. Let's say someone loses a top tackle one of their starting tackles this year, and they're like, oh man, we need someone who's had starting experience. The Steelers would be a prime place to go get that for not that expensive. And what could the Steelers ask for in return? Maybe a similarly grading wide receiver who, isn't prolific, but has been a starter in the NFL. I think that's the plan right now, is kind of give themselves a chance to evaluate the talent they have at wide receiver in training camp. And then if they don't like what they see, they'll go and get somebody else that they have in mind. And I think that's when, if there's a trade, you'll see it happen, is when we get to like August or sometime like that.
Right. If there is a big wide receiver move made by the Steelers, Chris,
right.
Do you think that Courtland Sutton is the most realistic option? I know that Brandon Ayuk has been floated here and there, but again, this doesn't only rely on Pittsburgh and their want to get a receiver. It also relies on the other teams, like you talked about with Denver and Courtland Sutton, their ability to move off. So what would a big move look like to you? Do you think Sutton is the most realistic guy for them at this point?
I think so, because of the value that he would bring in, as far as, or value it would take to get him. I don't think that you would have to, like, if you go for Brandon Ayuk, you're going to be giving up several picks, and you're going to be paying him huge money for years to come. But if you get Courtland Sutton, you're probably not giving up huge picks for him. Like, you might give up like an early day 3 pick, but you're not spending a day 2 or a day 1 pick to get Courtland Sutton. And he also wouldn't cost you that much. He'd be there for 2 years. The Broncos would most likely take on most of that cap hit this upcoming season, and then you could either rework a deal or just see what you want to do the year after. But I think he just makes sense the most contractually and also trade-wise, what it would take to get him. But like, some people are talking about DK Metcalf. The Seahawks ain't coming up off DK Metcalf. They be out their mind. So I think that guys like him, Devontae Adams wants to stay in Las Vegas. Like, let's put those to bed. I would say, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk could make sense if the Niners came down off their asking price, but I don't think they will. I think that they recognize the talent that those guys had. And let's face it, the Niners want to win now. So if they got to stomach the bill for 2 high paying wide receivers for another year and not get any draft capital out of it, so be it. But, if they can win a Super Bowl next year, they'll be like, that was worth the stomaching that. So I think that, if there's a move, Courtland Sutton makes the most sense. The Broncos would make sense to be sellers, and also I don't think it would take as much to get it.
Right. And I think too, when you're talking about the draft, Chris, you mentioned Roman Wilson and everything that he's going to potentially bring to the table for Pittsburgh, but we haven't talked about Pittsburgh's draft yet, even though we're a couple weeks removed. You mentioned Troy Fautanu there, their first round selection, who I think they feel pretty confident in, but how do you think Pittsburgh did when it comes to value, when it comes to positional need, and how they maneuvered through that draft process?
I thought they did fantastic as far as getting value for especially their first 4 picks. They had 2 picks in the 3rd round, a 2nd round, and a 1st round pick. Fautanu was my 14th ranked player. He was ranked in their top 10. They got him at 20th. So that was great value. Zach Frazier was my 29th ranked player. They got him at 51st. Peyton Wilson, I think, was around the same range there as far as where I ranked him. They got him in the 3rd round. And then Roman Wilson, I had ranked at 45 on my big board. And he was, it was picked at like 81 or whatever. So you're looking at a lot of players who, at least on my big board and how I ranked the top 100 guys that I had on the list, they scored big on every one of them, and at positions of need and of positions of value. Offensive tackle is so important in today's NFL. Now you have Broderick Jones and Troy Fautanu in back-to-back years. Now you can say, like, hey, the offensive line's pretty much set as far as high picks there. You don't have to reinvest there for a while. Zach Frazier, they desperately needed a center, and there were about like 3 guys that I thought were plug-and-play centers. They got one of them, and I thought it turns out one of those guys, Jackson Powers-Johnson, probably isn't even going to play center, so there might have been actually just 2 guys who were in that board there. And then you get a Roman Wilson, a guy who played slot in outside for Michigan over the years and looks like a guy who could, plug in and eventually become a starting wide receiver for the Steelers, in the 3rd round, while also getting Peyton Wilson, who was my top graded linebacker. The biggest question was, would he, have injury concerns coming in? And so certainly he had him in the draft process, but if he could be healthy in the NFL, that's why everyone backed off of him. So you get a playmaking linebacker, a potential playmaking wide receiver, a physically dominant center, and a really athletic, dominant, right tackle option for the Steelers. That was a ton of their needs, and they dressed him with the 4 picks. I thought that they did a very good job. Omar Khan, and it was funny, last year, Omar Khan was trading up and down the board to get his picks. This year, stayed pat at every single one of them and got their targets. it's impressive how he's been able to read the league so far.
Chris is great. For more on Chris's work, check him out over the Locked On Steelers podcast and right here on Locked On NFL, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Coming up in the second part of this show, we're going to be talking with Tyler Rowland of Locked On Titans. The Titans adding some firepower. Stay tuned. Plenty to talk about here on Locked On NFL. First, the show is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors is everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level up peak performance, superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has it covered. With over 120 million parts, the number one ride or die will always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Visit eBay Motors, your burden rubber, not cash. All the parts you need, the prices you want. It's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Also, as low exclusion supply, eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. We are back, our second segment of Locked On NFL. Kevin Oestreicher still talking with you here on this Monday. We just talked with Chris Carter of Locked On Steelers. Now we'll be joined by Tyler Rowland of Locked On Titans. The Titans have added a lot over the course of this offseason. They added more last week in Tyler Boyd. We'll talk with Tyler Rowland about that now. The Tennessee Titans just continue to add more firepower to their roster ahead of the 2024 season. Here to talk about that and obviously all things Titans with me is Tyler Rowland, the host of Locked On Titans. And Tyler, there's been a lot of excitement in Tennessee this offseason. Seems like the moves are coming in at just an all-time rate. That's honestly what you should be doing when you have a rookie quarterback on a rookie quarterback contract, and Tennessee is certainly taking advantage of that. Now, we'll get into the roster, how it looks with all the bigger moves the Titans have made in a couple of minutes. But I want to start with the most recent one, and that being Tyler Boyd being added to Tennessee's receiver room. Obviously, receiver was a big point of emphasis for Tennessee going into the offseason. Calvin Ridley now a member of the team. But Tyler Boyd gives you that been there, done that veteran, really solid receiver that can pick up first downs. How'd you like the move?
I think it was a fantastic move for the Titans. I think you kind of led in with it, Kevin, but the reality is all of these moves are to find one answer. Is Will Levis the guy? You know, that's what the Titans need to find out right now in this next 2-year period where they don't have a ton of their own homegrown drafted kids to pay. And, you know, they can spend some money here on outside free agents because sadly the previous general manager drafted so poorly for years and years and years. There is no one that they're going to miss out on paying. So you go out and you get a ton of veteran free agents, you bring them in and you try to figure out, do you have it in Will Levis? Is he the guy that you should continue to build around? And Tyler Boyd is just another extension of that philosophy. So you get a guy, get him in the slot, played for Brian Callahan in Cincinnati, and Tyler Boyd isn't your traditional slot. Yes, he's quick. Yes, he's a chain mover, but he's 6'2", 200 pounds. He's a bigger physical slot, and in an offense from Brian Callahan, which we expect to see a lot more 3-wide receiver, you're going to need a bigger slot who can kind of function almost as a tight end at times, can be that chain mover on passing downs, but can get in there and dig out a safety or a linebacker in the run game on early downs when you're in 3-wide receiver looks. So Tyler Boyd is a great fit. Obviously, the Brian Callahan connection from Cincinnati, he's somebody who they know what they're getting in him, the kind of culture guy that he'll be in the locker room in this first year tenure of a new head coach. But also, again, it's just a chain mover for Will Levis. When you have Calvin Ridley on the outside as kind of your Z speed receiver, and then you have DeAndre Hopkins who can be your physical X receiver, the Titans really needed that slot guy to kind of cap things off. And that's something that the coaching staff had talked about in recent weeks. Brian Callahan said the Titans needed someone to emerge in the slot. And he mentioned guys like Kyle Phillips and Nick Westbrook-Akine and undrafted guy from a few years ago, Mason Kinsey. Like, it just wasn't good enough. And some people thought maybe Treylon Burks would jump into that role, but I don't think you can really go into a season counting on Treylon Burks to be anything. He's more of a luxury cherry on top he gives you anything at this point. So I think having Tyler Boyd, having 3 veteran receivers that you can count on that fit perfectly together in your system to help you, again, get a look at Will Levis. I think it was a great move for the Titans, and the price that they paid, 1-year deal up to $4.5 million, probably around $3 million guaranteed in reality. I think that you can't really say anything negative about the move. It just makes too much sense on too many levels from both sides.
And I know, Tyler, we're a couple of weeks removed from the 2024 draft, but we haven't had a chance, you and I, to talk about Tennessee's draft class here on this show. Obviously, offensive line was always going to be a big point of emphasis for Tennessee, pairing a guy with Peter Skoronski, who they took last year. But the board fell in, I think, a different way than some Titans fans maybe imagined it. And they take – it was an interesting pick at the time, but I think you're already seeing some of the dividends paying off, especially some of the clips that have come out during rookie minicamp.
Yeah, right.
How did you like Tennessee's draft based off of the board that they were given and that they had to work with?
Yeah, well, I think that, once Joe Alt goes off the board, I think the consensus Titans pick, obviously isn't available. You have to pivot. I think there was a strong case for Rome Odunze, just a really good player who I think went underrated during the process. But you can't bat an eye at taking J.C. Latham there. And we got a report from Diana Rossini from The Athletic that J.C. Latham was Bill Callahan's favorite offensive tackle from the class. Raw power, the strongest hands that I have seen from any college offensive lineman that I've watched in my time. Great anchor, and a guy who played at like 360 pounds at Alabama, who's going to play more around 340, 345 for the Titans, which should add some increased mobility. There's some question about him going from right tackle at Alabama to left tackle for the Titans, but this guy played at IMG Academy in high school and was a 5-star recruit as a left tackle. Came into Alabama, and they had a future first-round pick in Evan Neal at left tackle, and Alabama said, hey, for the continuity of our offensive line, we're going to move you to right tackle. So I think some of those concerns about the switch are overblown, but the Titans desperately needed offensive tackle help, and Latham definitely fits the profile of a Bill Callahan, Titans offensive line coach, of his style of player with power, and Tyron Smith and Jedrick Wills. This has been done before by Bill Callahan. He's one of the best offensive line coaches in the history of the sport for a reason. So I think getting Latham there after Alt was off the board was definitely a strong move for the Titans. And going past that, I mean, T'Vondre Sweat at 38, I can't say I was a huge fan of that pick. I thought it was a bit of a reach, and the positional value just doesn't really hit for me there. But if you look at the Titans' perspective, they're like, hey, we're drafting monster athletes. These guys are huge. They're powerful, they're big men, but they also have really good athleticism. So at the end of the day, football is a big man sport, and the best teams in the NFL have big athletic players. And I think that's the route the Titans decided to go. Will it pay off with both these guys? That remains to be seen. But I think you kind of understand the philosophy that they're going with here as they try to, really restart the young part of this roster after signing so many veterans.
Now, it really feels like, Tyler, the whole AFC South has had a really strong offseason. All four teams have. They've been adding firepower. The drafts seem to have been pretty good for all four teams, too. Where do you see post-draft? Do you see Tennessee as a team that is unequivocally in that conversation to compete for the AFC South title? I know Houston is defending that, and they themselves have a quarterback on a rookie contract. Obviously, Indianapolis getting Anthony Richardson back. Then you have Jacksonville with Trevor Lawrence. Where do you see Tennessee in the AFC South fold? Are they favorites? Are they in the middle? Are they towards the bottom? Where are you right now on that?
Well, I would say they're in the middle, in my opinion, and I think they can be playoff contenders. I think there's a large contingent of people who have the Titans as, bottom of the power rankings, and they're over under on FanDuel Sportsbook right now is like 6.5 wins. So clearly the outside world is not expecting much from the Titans. But I think with all that they added, I think that Mike Vrabel is a very good coach. Kevin, we've talked about this. I think he's a good coach, but I think they could have improved coaching, not only from the head coach, but from the rest of the staff. I think that'll be critical. So I think the Titans, I wouldn't say, I don't think they should be favorites to win the division or anything like that. But I definitely do think the Titans should be contending for the playoffs, whether it be a wild card spot, whether Houston doesn't have as good of a year as we think, and the Titans maybe compete for the division there. But I think, going to the last month of the season, the Tennessee Titans should be on that playoff bubble, and they should be right there. And if they aren't, it's probably because Will Levis struggles and doesn't pan out the way that you think. But I got to tell you, Kevin, after being someone who wasn't high on Will Levis coming into the draft, I think what we saw from him last year with the terrible supporting cast around him, I have high hopes for Levis this year, and I think he should be able to lead the Titans to playoff contention if not the division contention. They should definitely be fighting for one of those 7 playoff spots.
Tyler is great and always brings the Titans insight. And for more on Tyler, check him out over at Locked On Titans and right here on Locked On NFL, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Coming up, still a lot to get to in the final part of the show. Your boy Q of Locked On Raiders will join us. We'll talk about the Raiders revamping their offense. Stay tuned. We've got plenty to talk about here on Locked On NFL. First, this show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big one of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. I'm a big Denver Nuggets guy, so if you're betting on that Denver series with the Minnesota Timberwolves, you can go Nikola Jokic props, Anthony Edwards props. We'll see how that all unfolds as the series continues. Visit FanDuel.com/lockdown to make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. We are back, our final segment of Locked On NFL. Kevin Oestreicher still talking with you here. Again, really appreciate everybody for tuning in today, making Locked On NFL your first listen each and every single day. Be sure to subscribe in video form and audio form for 5 days a week of NFL content. Let's round out the show today by talking with your boy Q of Locked On Raiders. The Raiders are in an interesting situation, but they continue to add to their offense. Let's talk with your boy Q now. Big year upcoming for the Las Vegas Raiders, and they've certainly been revamping their offense over the last few weeks here. Here to talk about that with me is your boy Q, the host of Locked On Raiders. And Q, I want to start with wide receiver. We'll get into the draft and what they did there because that was obviously a big point of the revamp. But the Raiders have signed a couple of veteran wide receivers over the last week or so. Michael Gallup coming over from Dallas. Then you have Jalen Guyton from the Chargers. You pair those guys up with Devontae Adams, obviously. How's the wide receiver room in Vegas looking right now?
I think it's looking competitive. I think that's the biggest deal, right? I mean, Michael Gallup has a heck of a name, but I don't think anyone thinks that he's a number 1 wide receiver. He's not a number 1. He's not a number 2. But if you're talking about he could be a potential number 3, okay, now you're talking about something. Jalen Guyton, same thing, right? He's a guy that has some speed. He has some size, and the Raiders didn't score a lot of points in 2023. So I think he's a guy that can, again, compete for a third spot on the wide receiver depth chart, maybe the 4th spot, whatever the case may be. But he provides a different type of element as far as stretching the field, especially with that speed. And Michael Gallup, I mean, look, there's a reason why the Cowboys gave him a ton of money at one point. It didn't work out because of injuries. But if he's healthy, we know he's a really good wide receiver. Again, not asking him to be number 1, not asking him to be number 2, just asking him to be a good number 3 or potentially number 4 wide receiver. So as far as just what it looks like right now, Devontae Adams, Jacoby Myers, that's 1, 2. Of course, Brock Bowers, and I know we'll get to him at some point, brought in as the 13th overall pick in this past year's draft. I know he's a tight end, but he's just a weapon. You got Michael Mayer, the tight end that was drafted in the 2nd round last year. They got Trey Tucker, a guy that was drafted in, the 4th round or 5th round last season. He's speed, more speed. So, I mean, the wide receiver room, like I said, is looking very competitive, and that's what the Raiders need to do, get as many weapons on that offensive side of the ball because they didn't score very many points in 2023. So that's got to be a major priority.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Brock Bowers. Let's just get right into the draft class. I think a lot of Raiders fans very excited to have a tight end of that caliber. Obviously, you mentioned Michael Mayer still being there. Makes a heck of a 1-2, especially with some young guys on rookie contracts. But Jackson Powers-Johnson comes in. How did you like what Las Vegas was able to do with the draft this year?
I thought the draft was really good. I mean, and it's funny because there's so many times covering the Raiders, watching the Raiders, being a fan of the Raiders, seeing the draft shake out, and there's so many questions that I have, and being shocked and surprised by what they were able to do or what they did do. And this year I was shocked and surprised because of Brock Bowers at number 13, but it wasn't because it was a bad shock or a bad surprise. It was like, wow. 1, he was there at 13. 2, I never saw him coming. I mean, I'll be honest, the whole couple months leading up to the draft, I never once said, Brock Bowers might be in play for the Raiders at 13. Like, I just never did that, and that's my fault. But he's a hell of a weapon. And so I look at the Raiders draft completely, from the 1st round to the 7th round. They never moved. They never traded up. They never traded down. But it looked like they collected a lot of solid players. And so I was pretty pleased with the overall haul. Obviously, these players got to go out there and put their best foot forward and show what they can bring to the table. But, I mean, it looks pretty solid. And I think for the most part, Raider Nation is not used to a draft that actually makes sense. More times than not, we scratch our head and say, well, that didn't really seem right. But, I mean, you get, a big-time tight end that's a weapon that many people believe is the one of the best players in the draft. You get a couple offensive linemen. You got some guys in the secondary. I mean, you got some dudes, right? I mean, you all of a sudden you got a running back that could be very versatile. You feel pretty good about the haul that they have. So, yeah, all in all, when I look at the draft, I think well done by Tom Telesco in his first year with the Raiders.
Yeah, you get a couple of vet wide receivers. You get Brock Bowers as a heck of a tight end, and you're building up that offense for whoever is going to be throwing the ball for Las Vegas this season. Now, there are a couple options on the roster here. I know we talked about it a bit before we started up here. Aiden O'Connell, Gardner Minshew. Those are the two guys that Las Vegas is working with right now. How do you expect that quarterback competition to play out, and how confident are you in either of those two guys to lead the Raiders to some wins this year?
I mean, for me, I was hoping that the Raiders were going to be able to go out and find their, potential difference maker franchise quarterback, right? I was hoping that they were going to be able to, maneuver and shake and try to trade up a little bit in the draft and go get their guy. It just wasn't in the cards. It didn't work out. Aiden O'Connell, who was a rookie last season, proved that he could win some games, right? Especially down the stretch of the season, the last like 4 or 5 games, he really looked a lot better than he did when he first got his feet wet as far as a starting quarterback. And then Gardner Minshew, we all know, has won games. Is he the guy that you want to hang your hat on? And man, Gardner Minshew is my starting quarterback. Not really, but you know that he can win some games. So I think that right now, Aiden O'Connell is probably the leader in the clubhouse, only because he was a starter last year. And I know Antonio Pierce has said he's the starting quarterback, but he's going to have competition. That competition is going to be Gardner Minshew. So, they're going to battle it out in training camp. That's going to be one of the biggest storylines for the Raiders. Who's going to be that QB1? Who's going to be the backup quarterback? They gave $15 million fully guaranteed for Gardner Minshew for the next couple of years. So there's that. It's not a whole lot of money, but it's not chump change either. So, there's that element of it. But right now it feels like it's the Aiden O'Connell job, and it's Gardner Minshew's opportunity to go up there and steal that job. But when training camp opens up, man, that's going to be the biggest storyline for the Raiders for sure.
Now, someone that you and I talked a whole lot about, Q, was Josh Jacobs over the course of the last year and some change, and he's now in Green Bay. Seems like the heir apparent there in Las Vegas is Zamir White. He showed some stuff last season, later in the year, showed that he has the potential to take over for Jacobs and have it be a transition that might not be as painful as some might imagine, going from a guy as accomplished as Josh Jacobs to more of an unproven talent in Zamir White. But how confident are you that White and the rest of these Raiders running backs can make up for the loss of Jacobs, which is no easy thing?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a big task, man. I mean, I think that losing Josh Jacobs is bigger than a lot of people think. I mean, I really do. I think that he is a big-time leader. Obviously, he's a guy that has a lot of production with the silver and black. He's able to, he made sense of the Raiders when the Raiders weren't making sense. When the offense couldn't find their way, he tried to help find their way for them. He's a guy that, as a veteran, was playing in the Hall of Fame game during the preseason to prove himself when he didn't get his 5th-year option picked up. And I mean, there's a lot to like about Josh Jacobs. And with that being said, he's coached up Zamir White a lot. So it's the Zamir White show. I know it's running back by committee, so it's not going to just necessarily be one workhorse anymore. I mean, that's what Tom Telesco said, that the league isn't really based like that anymore. So they have Zamir White. They have Alexander Madison that they brought in from the Vikings. They just drafted Dylan Lobby, a 6th-round pick out of New Hampshire. He's probably going to play a Danny Woodhead type role, maybe even an Austin Eckler type role. Zamir White's got some big shoes to fill. I think he's up for the challenge, but it's still some big shoes to fill.
Something else you and I talked a lot about, Q, was how incredible we thought the AFC West was going to be over these last couple of seasons. I think obviously you have the defending champs back-to-back in Kansas City, the Chargers bringing in a whole bunch of new personnel. And I mean, that's where Tom Telesco came from for Las Vegas. So they've been shuffling over there. Denver's going through a bit of a rebuild right now. But with Las Vegas, where do you slot them in the AFC West? Because I think it's so intriguing. Obviously, Kansas City is going to be the favorite. There's no question about that. But the other three, where do you put Las Vegas in that?
I think that the other 3 positions are wide open. I really do. I mean, Kansas City is going to be Kansas City. They're going to be the number 1 team in the division until they're proven otherwise. But I think that the rest of the spots are wide open. I mean, I really do. Every year, everyone tells me that the Chargers are going to be this great team and they're going to go and this is their year and the Raiders are going to end up in dead last and Denver's going to take that next step. And well, every year it seems like that's not the case. It seems like the Raiders end up in that second spot or closely tied to that second spot, whatever the case may be. So I do think that it's wide open between the Raiders and the Chargers for the number 2 spot in the division. And I think the Broncos this year will probably pull up the rear, but I do think that they're going to be better. I just think that they still obviously have some work to do, right? They've got to maybe Bo Nix is their guy. They didn't have a lot of draft picks to work with. They don't have a lot of money that they had to work with this year. So I do think Sean Payton's going to get it turned around there. I just don't see it right away. And I do think that Jim Harbaugh is going to get things turned around with the Chargers. And the question is it going to be this year or not? So I think that race for the number 2 spot in the AFC West is going to be a fun one, and really going to boil down to the Chargers and the Raiders. But we'll see. I mean, we talk about it every year, and there's a reason why they play the game. So we'll see how it shakes out.
Q was great. And for more on the Raiders, check him out over at the Locked On Raiders podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. That's all I have for you here today on Locked On NFL. Thank you so much for tuning in. Coming up tomorrow, more NFL content with the Tuesday host. So be sure to stay tuned for that. We'll see you right back here tomorrow on Locked On NFL.